Hello and welcome to Mind Shifters Radio. I'm Tim Hayes. I'm your host for the first hour, and today's Monday, July 26th, 2021. And today, our first hour will be a replay of an interview I did with Dr. Pat Ogden, who's the founder of Sensory Motor Psychotherapy. In the second hour, Jeannie and Michael will be here. Please enjoy this interview.
Well, Pat, thank you so much for joining us here today, and I greatly appreciate your taking the time. I realize you're squeezing this in. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what got you started in the work you're doing and what drives your passion for this work with traumas?
Okay, sure. Well, the work that I do is based in the body. It's called sensory motor psychotherapy. So we really look at how the body participates in the legacy of trauma and attachment wounds and systemic oppression and so forth. And I got interested probably as a child because my body was my resource. Like I was really active, and if I was stressed, I would go into my body and go running, go to the woods, go to the lake. So I think that was the beginning. I developed a strong confidence in my own body. In the early 1970s, I was working at a psychiatric hospital, and I was teaching yoga and dance. And what I found was that the patients who did both those classes seemed to get better. And that really piqued my curiosity about the role of the body in mental health and in healing trauma, because many of those patients were traumatized. And then it just started rolling from there. I met Ron Kurtz, who is the first person I had ever encountered who felt that the body could be an avenue to implicit memories, implicit beliefs, childhood issues that maybe we'd even forgotten. So that was a big influence. And I moved to Colorado with Ron, started studying all kinds of movement work and body work, and really kind of went out on a limb in a lot of ways in what I was doing, because I was very interested in helping people shift how they live in the body. And in the late 70s, I was an adjunct therapist for the clinic here at the University of Boulder. And the clients that were referred to me were clients who had all been traumatized. I didn't know that at the time because nobody was talking about trauma. They'd all been sexually abused, and they were sent to me because these women couldn't experience sexual pleasure. And everything that I had been taught didn't work with these women. They got more dysregulated. Sometimes they'd come back the next week feeling worse. And I was baffled because I was doing everything I thought the right way. And I started thinking, well, I'm just going to try to keep them connected to their bodies. We're not going to go into strong emotions. We're not going to revisit the memories. We're just going to stay connected to the body. And they started getting better. At least they stopped getting worse. So that was a really big learning for me. It was long before people even started talking about trauma. So then I started my own school, started teaching, and
You just kind of learned as you went, huh?
I did learn as I went, and I studied a lot of alternative methodology. The Rolf method of structural integration, which works with alignment and posture in the body, but it's a hands-on body work. And I studied all kinds of movement disciplines. So I really had kind of an alternative approach. And then I met Bessel van der Kolk in the mid-'90s. And he's a premier trauma therapist, wrote an incredible book called The Body Keeps the Score. And he started introducing me to more traditional approaches and kind of integrating my work into that world. So since then, since the mid-'90s, I've been working a lot with neuroscientists and attachment experts and people in the field of dissociation. learning how those fields really interface with my work with the body. Yeah.
Well, so you have this website, sensorymotor.org, and you train therapists in sensory motor psychotherapy.
Correct.
And people can actually go to your website, sensorymotor.org, and type in their location and find out if there's any therapists who've been trained through your organization that are relatively close to them. What's one of the primary things that you can tell us, or the people listening who might be thinking about wanting a therapist to work through some therapy, that separates the sensory motor psychotherapy approach from traditional talk therapy?
Primarily, what separates sensory motor psychotherapy from talk therapy is that a sensory motor psychotherapist is looking at how the body participates in the legacy of trauma and relational issues. So, for example, a traumatized client might have a posture like this, and they might be frightened, and they might live with that fear from their trauma. And so we know that we're going to have more success in helping them if they can shift how they live in the body, because as long as the shoulders stay like this, the fear is sustained. And we'll look at whatever the presenting difficulty is of the client. It's got to show up in the body, because we all have a body. Everything we experience is through the body. So no matter what the client comes with, we look at how the body reflects the issues. Many traumatized clients live kind of outside a window of tolerance, so they feel dysregulated, like anxious and hyper-aroused, or else just kind of deadened and hypo-aroused. So we want to work with the body with what we call somatic resources to help bring arousal into that window of tolerance where a person can be in the present moment. A friend of mine, Anno Vanderhart, coined the term trauma time, saying most traumatized clients live in trauma time, which means that it feels like the trauma is still happening. It's still impacting our day-to-day experience. And that's really disconcerting for a survivor.
Well, and as you mentioned a little bit earlier, you started this kind of work at a time when people weren't even really talking about trauma. And the more I've been exploring with different people and interviewing different professionals who do integrative or functional or holistic psychiatry or therapy or medical work, the more I'm hearing them say that they're waking up to the realization that many of the symptom patterns they're seeing are directly related to trauma, childhood trauma and others. And so that's being talked about now far more fluidly and consistently than it was back in the 70s and 80s. How has that changed what you do with people or training therapists? The idea that now it's getting to be more accepted.
It hasn't changed how we train therapists at Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute, but it has validated what we do. So the body is becoming more and more mainstream. Working with the body to heal from the effects of trauma is becoming more and more mainstream. So we have a lot more visibility, a lot more therapists coming to study with us. But you know what you say about functional medicine and holistic approaches looking at the effects of trauma, what I want to say about that is two very obvious ways to look at that is that when a trauma happens, our arousal will shoot up really high to mobilize us to defend ourselves or to get away or to get help. And if that doesn't work, our arousal will just plummet to this deadened, shut down state. And for trauma survivors, those states of arousal are outside of that window of tolerance, and that compromises our immune system over time. So trauma survivors have a, sequelae of physical issues that emerge from unresolved trauma. Another way to think of it is many childhood abuse survivors went into more of a collapsed, shut down state. So the body's often collapsed and pulled in. And that becomes a habit, a habitual way of living in the body. And a posture like this is not good for our bodies. There's not room for the organs. We can't take a deep breath. It constricts the heart. So how we inhabit our body is not only related to psychological health, but our physical health. Yeah. So this very strong connection.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, when we're in the studies of some of the cellular biologists like Bruce Lipton are recognizing that when you're in a stress state, mental, emotional stress state, that will override the physical signals to your body, and your cells will start to go into that shutdown and protection mode, which means also if you have to run or fight for your life, you don't really need to worry about healing the cut on your hand. So the whole immune system shuts down because that takes a lot of energy. And if we live, as so many of us do, in that accelerated high stress or near fight or flight level, we're living in a suppressed immune system state, which leaves us so vulnerable, as you said, to this whole series of problems. Go ahead.
Well, if I could say something about that, that's even more critical for people for whom the trauma is not over. Like many of my clients, they had trauma in childhood, now it's over, and they're relatively safe. But for a Black person, for example, it can be dangerous just walking down the street. There's the constant threat of aggression, what can happen if you don't control your emotions and your body. If you're stopped by the police and so forth, you could lose your life. So for people who are marginalized, whether they're transgender or African American or Asian, there's so many societal threats that are still ongoing that it's a challenge to bring the arousal quickly back into a window.
Yeah, and the wear and tear on our energy systems physiologically to be in that constant high stress state,
right,
is and of course there are some of those when you're actually in a war zone and your whole town, your whole community is in the war zone with you. People come together and there's a support that happens. But when we're living in these isolated apartments and houses and condos and we don't have that sense of community and we're living at that high stress level, there's just a whole series of factors that tear the energy system down.
That's really true. They say that the best inoculation against post-traumatic stress disorder is a secure attachment relationship in childhood, like where you have secure relationships, you can count on each other, and then when you're an adult, if you do have trauma, you're much less likely to get PTSD if you have that foundation.
Wouldn't it be great if we could give that to more people? Well, so, there are so many ways that I would want to take a conversation with you because you've been at this for so long, and there are so many different aspects of trauma work. One of the things I like to do with these discussions is help people who might either have a family member who needs a therapy or support for a trauma or a mental health challenge, or the actual individual who might be looking for a therapist. And so aside from looking at going to sensorymotorpsychotherapy.org and looking for a provider, what kinds of things would you tell a person who's looking for a therapist to help with trauma that he or she should be looking for in the therapist?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think first and foremost, you've got to trust your gut. If it's a good connection with the person, if you feel safe and confident in them, then half the journey is won already. You know, half the battle's won. I mean, I'm biased towards work with the body because trauma first and foremost affects the body. It affects our arousal level, and it affects our somatic system as we prepare to protect ourselves and make ourselves safe. So if I were looking for a trauma therapist, I would look for someone who did understand the role of the body and incorporated some somatic approaches. Many clients are frustrated trying to resolve their trauma through insight, through cognition, because that's not where trauma first has its effect. When we're threatened, our instincts, our subcortical instincts, are mobilized for survival. For example, if you're taking a fall down the steps, you instinctively will grab for the railing before the signal that you're in danger gets to your thinking brain. And it's important to understand that with trauma because it's hard to resolve it cognitively, and it's also hard to resolve it by expressing emotions related to it. One of my teachers who died the year I was born, so I never met him, is Pierre Genet, and he talks about what he calls vehement emotions, that the emotions connected with trauma can't be resolved by expressing them, because those emotions are designed to fuel our protective mechanisms. So you think of rage,
exactly, right? Like
so many, veterans that I've worked with have this uncontrollable rage that's associated with a fight response, and they've tried everything, and they can't often can't modulate it because it has to do with the subcortical impulses. So I think I would look for somebody who had an understanding of the body's role in trauma, because I think there's the likelihood that you'd have more success working at the level where trauma first impacts.
I think as you're talking about Peter Levine and how he talks about his own trauma, trying to walk through a crosswalk and getting hit. It's like, who's the woman neurologist who had the stroke, her stroke of genius. When you have somebody who's trained in that body of work and then they go through that problem themselves. So the analysis that Peter Levine talks about, being aware of all his physical responses and the self-protective motions, and then the energies vibrating in his body, and being able to understand that he doesn't want to fight them off and he doesn't want to restrict them, and being able to stay aware of those energies, being able to work with somebody who won't try to get you to either shut down your emotions or spend a whole lot of time in your emotions if you're having a physical response. I think that's highly desirable in someone who's going to work with trauma, that they're able to see the whole energy system and be trained in the kind of thing you do at sensorymotorpsychotherapy.com or .org. Is there a story or two that you could share about someone who's really shifted with the sensory motor approach to psychotherapy?
Oh, there's so many stories. Any particular kind of client that you're interested in? I could talk about a veteran or an abuse survivor, or I'll tell you a couple stories,
right.
Unless you have a suggestion.
We've done both of those recently, so either way you want to go.
Okay. Well, one rather dramatic shift that I'm thinking of was a client, I'll call her Tessa, and when she, this was a consultation client, her therapist brought her in, her therapist was there as well to do a consultation with me, and she'd been a sex worker since she was 13 years old, had been abused all through her life, had been raped repeatedly, and she had, as she said, I have no worth, I have no value. She said, if a bus hit me tomorrow, nobody should mourn because it'd be better off if I'm not here, right? And the whole time that she was talking, she was, her body was pretty tight, but there was this little motion of her fingers, like her hands were in her lap, but her fingers would come up like this every once in a while. And this is an important element in trauma therapy because these little preparatory movements are often indicative of a larger movement that wanted to happen but couldn't happen. And, we can imagine as a child and with all these times she'd been attacked, that her pushing away and trying to defend herself was futile. It didn't help at all. So when I tracked that and I asked her to be aware of it, and I just held a pillow against her hand, and it was as if some impulse ignited from within that she had completely abandoned because it had only made trauma worse in the past. And she started pushing against that pillow. And, when actions are being completed like that, there's a real sense of pleasure often. And she was like astonished at the force of the action and how good it felt in her body. But the thing that touched me the most was I asked her what it felt like, and tears started to come, and she said, it feels like hope, like maybe there's some hope. And it kind of ignited this a faith in the future, that a future could be different from the past.
Potential for change, yeah.
Yeah, and I think of that often with the body because we all abandon actions when they were ineffective at producing the desired outcome. So, if we weren't allowed to express ourselves, maybe we closed down. If our caregivers didn't respond to our proximity-seeking actions, we stopped reaching out, and so forth. So hope really lives in the movement vocabulary of the body, and Tessa found that hope with that action that was an instinctive action, but she had lost it through all her experience. So that's one client that I think about.
Which is just, as I sit here listening to that, the potential that is opened up for her in tapping into that is endless. Oh,
yes, it is. And it is with any action, I want to tell one other story because I think that this is important for people when they're resolving trauma. The problem with trauma is if we go into it, our arousal is going to get outside of the window really fast. So in sensory-motor psychotherapy, we work with like a traumatic memory step by step. For example, one veteran that I worked with who was frontline combat, when he thought about he just thought about the memory, he started to get anxious. And if I had said, well, tell me more about the memory now, his arousal would have just continued to shoot up. So instead, I said, okay, what would help your arousal come into that window? And he placed his hands on his torso, and we just stopped until his arousal settled, right? And so we just stayed with this. I did it with him, and his arousal started to settle. And then we went on to the content. And I think this bottom-up way of working with the body is because the content, like retelling, is reliving to some degree. And by retelling will stimulate those unmetabolized responses in the body. So with this client, the first one was the arousal, and his hands and our paws calmed it down. The next one was, he said, he felt like somebody was shooting at him, and his hands came up, and he wanted to his body wanted to do a pushing motion. So again, we stopped and just allowed that action, right? And we have to remember that we're always working with the effects of all the trauma, because we'll develop patterns of response in our body. So somebody might say, well, why do you do that action when his memory is about somebody shooting at him? That's not going to protect you from a bullet. But the threat mobilized that response, and so then we just trust his body, right? And so we did that action, he settled, the action felt good to him, then we went on with the content, and then he started trembling and shaking. And that was a moment where we wanted to put all the memory aside and again just go with his body and feel the trembling, let it sequence through his body, trusting that his body will process that if we can just stay with it, which it did. It's like it had this bell curve where it got stronger and then it settled. And, that one session of reworking the traumatic memory, I remember he said after that, he said for the first time in years, he could talk about what happened because we metabolized the leftovers in his body, the impulses and the sensations.
Yeah, I first encountered that really important pattern that you're discussing there in Babette Rothschild's book, The Body Remembers, and paying very close attention to the physical arousal and just stopping everything and helping the person experience that and find a way to get settled again before moving on. And it was one of the more effective pieces of working with people because then I wasn't pushing against anything.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to push them into some kind of resolution. I was allowing them to back away from whatever would feel threatening and experience this energy. And it wasn't until years later that I learned the kind of thing you're talking about, where actually picking up those little cues about emotions and letting them move through them. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's so often when we do that with people, it helps them let the mental emotional connections they need to see come to the surface, because now they're not in that fight or flight where they're locking everything down.
Well, see, that's an important thing, because through these kinds of somatic interventions, arousal does come into that window, and then other elements can come into awareness. But, it's tricky for a trauma therapist, because if you stay right in the middle of the window, you're not going to stimulate dysregulated arousal and truncated actions. So we have to work at the edge of that window. But with a trauma, someone who's traumatized, there's a danger of really exacerbating dissociative tendencies and dysregulation. So it's really an art.
Well, especially, as you said, if the person wasn't raised in a nurturing environment and didn't internalize that sense of safety and competence. And
right.
So, the whole thing about developing resources within a traumatized adult, helping them realize that they can be stronger and more consistent and more present for themselves than they have been in the past is just a whole powerful set of tools to have as a trauma therapist.
Yeah, it is. And that sense of being present for yourself, again, it's a lived sense in the body. Like, what does that feel like, it is different for everybody. But we want to get that somatic sense of nurturing and care for yourself. And, yeah.
So is there another story that you want to share where someone has made a significant shift just from the sensory motor work?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Well, I'm thinking of a woman who was really severely traumatized, severe abuse all through childhood, had a dissociative disorder. She couldn't feel her body at all. She was alexithymic, couldn't feel her emotions, couldn't feel her body. And she said to me, well, I know that I'm sad because tears are rolling down my face, but she said, I don't feel anything. It's just the tears rolling down. And this was, and she wanted to feel. The reason she wanted to feel was because she had a little boy who was, I think, 3 at the time of this work. And she said, I don't want to go through my whole life not having him because I don't feel anything for him. And she would do this exercise where she would touch her son's finger, and she would say, okay, there's all this love in my heart coming through my arm down into my finger, and then it's going into your finger and going all the way up into your heart. And she said he could really feel it, but she said, I felt nothing. So we started working with a positive experience, because often a positive memory can be safer for a person to start to feel their body. So she felt herself, she remembered riding her bike when she was little and the wind in her hair, and it felt so good. She said it's like freedom, and her body shifted a little bit from this posture to this posture. But then, as often happens, it was coupled with the horror of her childhood. And one of the worst, most painful things for her was that the only beings that she was attached to were the animals on the farm. Everyone in her family abused her. She was the only girl. Brothers, father, mother, they all abused her. And she was remembering losing all her friends. One by one, they were slaughtered. And she said her heart was broken, just broken. And so I asked her if she could bring her hands to her heart, and just, because she protected her heart with all this tension, if she could protect it that way. And she did it, and for a moment, it felt warm and safe, but only for a moment. And then she took her hands away, and she said, my brain's shutting down, I'm going to in a shutdown mode. And she was right on the brink of hyperarousal, about to shut down. And it's so interesting, because when we're working with somebody who's severely traumatized, there are kind of different parts of the self that hold the trauma. And another part of her is coming up that was terrified of any kindness towards herself. So we practiced movements. I remember she made a movement to keep the memories away because she was getting really overwhelmed. But we kept coming back to this motion, and gradually she could stay a little longer and a little longer and a little longer. So we're working here with complex trauma where there's abuse, but there's also severe relational failure, attachment failure, right? And in our work, she was learning to also bring some compassion towards herself, as well as with some of the other interventions of sequencing the hyperarousal, making actions that felt safe. And I remember after our work, she said, for the first time, it feels like I really did something. She said, all the other therapy was just talking, but this time I did something. But body therapy, like all therapy, it's not without risk. And for her, the work we did broke through her alexithymia. And she started to have pretty strong emotions coming up, and which, can be a little dysregulating in and of themselves. But she said, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and she could begin to process those emotions. And the most gratifying part is that she could start to actually pick up her son and hold her son. And that was very satisfying, of course. So that's another story.
Excellent story. And of course, I'm grateful that you say that, you know, when you do this, it contains risk, right? I'm going to access things that are very intense, that some part of my mind has decided it's not okay for me to know, and it's been keeping separated from my conscious awareness for years, if not decades. And so it's very important in my experience, and I'm frequently recommending this to people, to work with somebody who's specifically trained in trauma work, not just a good new technique that they've learned.
Yes, definitely.
Conceptual framework about the person, the whole mind-body energy system, the awareness that everything that we've done and all the symptoms that we've accumulated at one point or another were adaptive. They were there for some kind of a reason.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if I can honor that reason and I can be working with a therapist that understands that and isn't just trying to strip all the symptoms away, and then there's a much better chance that I'll move in a somewhat more straight line towards resolution, as opposed to opening up Pandora's box and then shrieking and running and recoiling even further into my rigid symptoms.
Right. And there's a risk of that with body therapy. And I like what you said. We always teach our students that every symptom, every part, every action, it does have a severe purpose, period. But many people who work with the body, there's a risk of failing to attend to how different movements and different postures reflect a part of the self. For example, I could give so many examples. For example, we often work with proximity-seeking actions, just simple reaching out. If you didn't have an attachment figure there for you as a child, it's hard to reach out to others, right? But if you're asking a client who was abused by their caregivers to practice that action, it's going to stimulate another part of them that's rooted in defensive responses. And that we have to be aware that we don't override one part for another, you know. So if we're practicing that action, we could ignore and override the part that's so frightened of it. And even with posture, like I was working once with a woman who was suicidal and her posture was so collapsed, and that just enforced her despondency, right? So the impulse was to help her find her alignment and feel better. But what does that do? That pushes this part that wants to kill herself underground, and then it can come up even more strongly. So we worked with sensing the part that was so despondent and slowly coming up only to the point where she still felt connected to that part, not to the point where that part was overridden. And I think this is so critical in working with the body, to pay attention so that our somatic work doesn't override a part of the self, especially when clients are at risk or dissociative.
Yeah, exactly. And there are so many good, solid, I'll say, therapy models, internal family systems and coherence therapy and a variety of others, too many to mention, that acknowledge the implicit emotional knowing and corrective or protective measure that underlies all of the symptomatology. And if we can honor that and help the person understand it, then we get an integration, we get better feedback for the whole system, and we get an adult who is more capable in the moment to do what's best for that adult.
It's so interesting because the buzzword for trauma, like you're saying, is integration. to really be able to integrate the past, integrate the parts of the self, integrate the emotions and the actions and all. Because I'm trained as a rolfer, I really look at somatic integration as well, like helping the body find its alignment with gravity and its integrative movements, which really opens up possibilities for people. So for me, the integration of mind and dissociative parts goes hand in hand with also the integration of the body and the access to a wide movement vocabulary.
And the access to the information that those physical tensions and postures and emotions carry. It's really valuable information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ron Kurtz used to say that if we help enough of the right kind of information come from the inside of the client to consciousness, then the system will automatically reorganize towards health. And I think that's true. When I learned to be a therapist in the 70s in the prison where I was a counselor and the psychiatric unit and even social work school, I was expected to have the answers for people. And it was a huge relief to learn that people have their answers inside and they have that capacity to heal inside themselves. So all we have to do is help them become aware of it. And it sounds like it's simple, but it isn't. It takes a lot of observational skills and training and everything else to really help people find that wisdom. Yeah.
Well, but as you say, the first step is to recognize that it's not me who has to come up with that answer. It's the person who has it within them.
Right.
And if I can, so that's a huge burden lifted off of me as the therapist to begin with.
Yeah.
As long as I can get my ego out of the way, and then the tools and the willingness to help that person explore themselves and their history and their internal implicit emotional knowings. That's truly the key for success in my experience.
And a big kind of paradigm shift in my work that is veering away from talk therapy is that we, in sensory-motor psychotherapy, and Ron introduced me to this as well in the 70s, we're much more interested in patterns of internal organization than we are in the content and the history. What we want to work with is how the person organizes their experience inside right this moment through their body sensation, their movement, the images that come up, the emotions, and the thoughts. And this is where, instead of having a conversation and talking about things, we work a lot with mindfulness. And I want to say, I've been teaching and working with mindfulness since the 70s, but it's only in the last several years that I've become aware of how Western culture has appropriated mindfulness from Eastern traditions. And I just want to acknowledge that, because in that process of appropriation, the true original meaning and practice of mindfulness has really shifted. So I want to acknowledge and express appreciation for the traditions that it comes from. But through mindfulness, we can be aware of our organization. Yeah? So if somebody is talking about being raped as a child, instead of just talking about it, we would ask, okay, so as you're talking about it right now, what starts to happen inside? Well, I feel I'm pulling back. I'm starting to feel scared. I have this thought, I'm never going to be safe. I have this image of this rapist in his eyes. And that's the organization of experience. It's not a conversation anymore at that point. And that's where change can really happen, is when we shift how we organize experience. Like clients will say after the work, things like, yeah, the rape happened, and they won't have this. They'll organize around it differently. That's why the veteran could talk about the combat, because he organized differently. Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff. The whole idea that I don't get to change my past, but I can absolutely change what I've made it mean about me and my life. I can reorganize it so that it has a whole different meaning.
Yeah, you can reorganize your internal response. That's right. Absolutely.
Well, I thank you so much for this time. I realize that we're pushing the limits here because I have something else I got to go do. But can you think for a minute briefly if there's something that I haven't even asked you about yet that you wanted to make sure to share with our listeners, either a new project you have going or a new book you're writing?
Well, I do have a new book coming out. It's called Sensory Motor Psychotherapy in Context. And it's really looking at how psychology itself was created by Europeans of Christian and Jewish ancestry for people of that population. And that has really permeated psychology. And our methodology has not been adapted to include other voices. And the emphasis of a Western approach, say, on research, will it silence other very valid ways of knowing from indigenous people and other traditions. So I am really excited about looking at systemic oppression and marginalized groups and the whole concept of privilege oppression dynamics, and trying to really, I feel a very strong moral responsibility to do my part to try to participate in making the world more equitable. And that includes addressing all the implicit bias that we grew up with, including about the body, and bringing a more equitable lens to our work as therapists as well.
As you say that and talk about that book, it makes me think about the book My Grandmother's Hands. Have you heard about that book?
Of course.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to reading your new book when it comes out. I'm grateful beyond words for your sharing your time with us. I would consider it an honor if you'd let us talk to you again after the book comes out.
Yeah, of course. This has been a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And be well until we get to talk again.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Take care.